Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Peace and blessings be upon you. This is Jummah Mubarak. There was a study about how people do business, and they categorized the strategies of people in regards to social interaction in three categories. The first are the takers. These are people who try to get the most out of every interaction for themselves. The second are the matchers. These are people who are looking for quid pro quo mutual benefit interactions. And the third are the givers. And the givers tend to offer favors. They're also unafraid to ask for favors. And they look for opportunities to help others, even if it doesn't benefit them. So when we think about the fundamental distinction between hypocrisy and belief, most of the examples relate to this understanding of a believer that the pie is not limited to even all of the possible resources on earth, even with technological value adds, but actually the pie includes the akhirah of paradise, and that the awards and rewards of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are unbounded. And it is this abundance mentality that leads somebody to take the difficult path of freeing a slave or feeding the hungry in a famine. And for my part, I have endeavored to give in a ridiculous proportion of my, even when I had no income and I only had some savings, and I would give away 20% of my savings. And then good fortune befell me. Allah looked out for me, and He used the beneficence of another Muslim who invested in me. So that was, in a way, a quid pro quo interaction because there's a profit motive in an investment instead of a gift. But it was also a great giving and a great risk taking in that sense. And at some level, his mentality was tilted by his iman, his trust, not belief, not an affirmation of facts, but a trust in the future and in the providence of Allah. When we think about the evil in Islam, we think of Wahhabism after a gentleman by that name. And what we should be thinking of is Jabarism, not Jabir, not the Jabir determinism idea, but Kareemism, inshallah. Kareem Abdul Jabbar, the famous basketball player. So this is a common trope of people taking divine names as their own. And indeed, Wahhabism has been the gift that keeps on giving in the form of sectarian wars and all sorts of horrors, and not to mention the daily torrent of jahiliyyah done in the name of Islam that we see on social media that drives so many from the deen and makes those of us who worship the one true God of justice and mercy feel a little bit unsafe. It makes us question our trust in God, because if these Wahhabi influenced individuals, and they might not be Salafist, they might be Malikiya, they might be 12 or Shia, and in some sense they're influenced by Wahhab. But our challenge in Iman is to trust enough in the nature of Allah as a quote unquote good deity. And good might have a subjective meaning to us, but there is an objective good that Allah is. And by trusting in that good, we are Wahhabists in the sense that we believe in Al-Wahhab, the giver of gifts, like this tree that has grown so tall and is fed by our our wastewater. It is its thirst is slaked abundantly, and it becomes a habitat for birds, and they gift us with song. And this emergence is not planned. This is a flowering of the nature of the creation that Al Wahhab, the true God of gift giving, has presented us. I often contemplate history of Islam and how it came to be like this, where we have tens of millions of people depending on charity because they have been widowed and orphaned by sectarian warfare and by the mismanagement of people who call themselves the party of God, the helpers of God, and so on. And yet they completely misunderstand God, and they have taken the Quran as a thing, not necessarily as a thing abandoned, but they have interpreted it as a thing of perpetual war instead of perpetual gift giving, which is the true essence of the Quran. And their fear of hypocrisy has led them to impoverish the widow while they teach the law, as Jesus alayhi salam warned us about in the Gospels, even if those Gospels are filled with Hassan and Daif hadiths. Even if that quote from Mark and Matthew is itself only a Hassan hadith, it's not necessarily something that Jesus alayhi salam said verbatim, but the historicity of its meaning is contextualized by his martyrdom and that of his brother James as-Sadiq, and its relevance to the history of Islam is paramount and obvious for those who question the status quo. And I think about what went wrong with the Mu'taziliyah in the Abbasid Caliphate, where subsequent to the Minha reversing, they went about codifying Islam and a historiography of falsehood and satanic warping of the Quran through thousands of fabricated hadiths. They took the word of man over the word of God, and they took fideistic obedience to what is presented as truth over the Quran's commandments of rational inquiry. And it's unfortunate indeed. The seeds of the Mu'taziliyah perpetuated the European Renaissance, and it was ultimately the Christians who Allah permitted to inherit the fruits of the knowledge and wisdom seeking that the Quran had ordained. Whereas the Muslim empires of the Renaissance period, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Ottomans, had enough technology and gunpowder, and they were content to stagnate. And then their fate was to be colonized. And what could have gone differently? Perhaps people have a simplistic understanding of what happened. They blame the Mu'tazili for persecuting their opponents. There are narratives that Ibn Hanbal and his followers were plotting a rebellion, and that they were drunk the night before their plotted attempt, and as such they were discovered And it was then that the Minha began. So this was then, in this narrative, a justifiable counterterrorism effort. And it frames a narrative of Muslims having to confront Muslim terrorism all the way back to the early days. And even indeed with the Khawarij in the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam. However, that narrative sounds a little bit fake. I mean, the Hanbaliya getting drunk, it sounds like a slander. And the truth may be more complicated. But what ultimately happened is that the problematic nature of governance, not by Ashura, by mutual consent, but by the autocracy of a self appointed Khalifa, and of course, succession crises were a major theme in this concept of power and this misunderstanding of the Quran, going back to the janazah of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam and the dispute between Abu Bakr's succession versus Ali. So that this would create a turbulence in the politics of the Abbasid Caliphate is completely predictable. You have a son of a monarch who has different beliefs, and so policies reverse entirely. And indeed, this is what ultimately happened, because the Mutaziliya weren't really in power. It was the caliphs that were in power. The caliphs were attracted to the Mutaziliya Aqidah because it is rational and its Tawheed is supreme, inshallah. However, when it became clear that the fundamentalism of Ibn Hanbal was more popular and resilient in its tenacity, the logical move to contain the power of the caliph was to adopt it and then to canonize it in the subsequent hadith collections. And the rest, as they say, is history. And this is very much a taker mindset. And if the Mutazili were, let's say, something like the American founding fathers, they were on a parliament together. You have Al Kindi and Al Jabri and so on, casting votes over various issues. Then perhaps they would have rationally sought out a quid pro quo approach. But clearly, within parliamentary politics, you can still have extremely authoritarian political moves, as we've seen with the way that some Western countries react to Islamic fundamentalism by infringing on the rights of women to wear hijab. And this is the other side of the coin to other authorities in Islamic republics persecuting women for not wearing hijab. And there is no compulsion in the deen. Therefore, they're both out of alignment with God's will, that people express piety in true volition and in sincerity rather than through coercion. So then the other option that would have been more realistic would have been for the Mutazili to recommend to the Khalifa that they create a council of advisors, of viziri, who, this is probably the etymology of the word advice, is ad-vizir, right? And they could have then invited Ahmed ibn Hanbal to have a seat at the table. Perhaps there would have been 8 people. And the Khalifa would have been under no strict obligation to accept their advice. But they would have at least represented different aspects of the public appeal in their popularity as individuals, and they would have personally felt, perhaps with some degree of frustration, that they have been listened to. And this would have been a primitive form of pre constitutional monarchy, and it would have paid lip service in a more complete elocution to the Quran's commandment to govern by mutual consent through Ashura. And indeed, this idea of an autocratic emir listening to advice that he is under no obligation to follow has been the default concept of what the Quran meant for much of Islamic history. And it is only in modernity, through imitation of Freemasons from the United States' founding, that countries like Pakistan and Iran adopt a more pluralist republic model. And perhaps indeed, if the Mu'taziliya had instituted this concept formally and been giving enough to have invited their rival, their primary rival, the way that Abraham Lincoln had appointed his cabinet in a contentious time, was called the team of rivals. And this is actually a very good strategy in a civil war to increase political stability. But it takes a tremendous faith in Allah and a tremendous emotional maturity to even consider it. And when we think about how that choice to be givers instead of quid pro quo by these rationalist Muslim eminent advisors, eminent thinkers of the Abbasid Caliphate might have changed Islamic history, the Abbasid Caliphate might not have gone into decline. The concept of Sunni Islam might have not been codified at all, or it might have been codified very differently. It might not have been codified as a sect, even one with a moderately broad ecumenical umbrella. The distinction between Shia and Sunni might not have been as pronounced, because in the Mu'taziliya school, the significance of Imam Ali was venerated and understood, even if his purported authority in law giving and abrogation was not recognized, which would have settled just fine with the majority of Muslims who were not Shia. And the Ismaili Caliphate of the Fatimids could have even been made peace with. There might not have needed been a sense of rebellion amongst them to formally create one. And of course, the Fatimid Caliphate, it collapsed with a different strategy. Instead of being intolerant of their opponents within Islam, they were very much tolerant of them. And Salahuddin famously rebelled against them within a high level of power in the Fatimid military hierarchy. But succession crises and violent usurpation between siblings in the royal lineage led to their weakening, to the point where Salahuddin could have successfully flipped the Fatimid Caliphate into the Ayyubid Caliphate. And it wasn't really a caliphate at that point. It was just a sultanate. And it didn't last long. They themselves were flipped by their slave soldiers and so on. So you can see the weakness of this domination and this power taking strategy, and how this is not really Islamic. So in your own life,